Now walk. Walk.
Before we get started, I want to say as a disclaimer that this video is not super analytical in nature. I go into a bit of analysis regarding the origins of online campfire culture, as well as what did and didn't work for me about today's topic. But make no mistake, this is a completely subjective take on a piece of media that I have been enamored with since I was a child. Most of the meat and potatoes of this video will be subjective commentary, colored by my own background and personal preferences and what I look for in horror media. So, as we go forward, please keep that in mind as you form your own opinions. Also, I have a cold, so proceed at your own risk. Oh, that's not bad. So, back in 2009, the website Something Awful was in its heyday. The website, which is still up, hosted articles, blog entries, and, most important for the purposes of this video, forums. Everything on Something Awful had a pretty comedic and satirical slant, like a millennial's take on The Onion, with blog posts having titles like, "Dear Furries, we were wrong," or "This magnificent bastard." And you scroll through and it's just a post about a shirtless guy with weirdly cut jorts walking through a gas station parking lot. It's a weird website, and looking back, it was very emblematic of what it was like to be online in the late 2000s. In June of 2009, a thread was posted on the Something Awful forums inviting users to create paranormal images in Photoshop and share them with their peers. Being super open-ended, many users took the prompt in different directions. However, one user, going by the alias Victor Surge, stood out from the rest. On June 8th, Victor posted 2 black and white images, each featuring an abnormally tall man lurking in the background. That figure? Dennis O'Hare. Just kidding, it was Slenderman. The Slenderman became popular almost immediately, with other forum users getting to work creating fake news articles about disappearing children, and art that supposedly depicted the Slenderman fighting knights in 1600s Germany. The Slenderman was sort of the internet's first great horror meme. It really kicked off the campfire story atmosphere that the online community's really taken to since his debut, and it's easy to see why. The images are very simple, vintage black and white photographs featuring a creepy looking man in the background invading a playground in a college campus, along with an excerpt of a report about missing children. Just enough depth and familiarity of place to give the creature an identity without condescending with an origin story. Thus, the mystery was formed. Who is this tall man? What does he want? Is he going to kidnap my fictitious children? The Slenderman scratched a really specific itch during its cultural moment. We, as a society, are sort of obsessed with terrible things happening to children. You know, we love stories about spooky monsters invading our homes and fucking up our lives, and many of us who are into horror respond well to the ambiguity that comes with the supernatural. And this certainly isn't a new phenomenon either. The Slenderman was the internet's Pied Piper, coming into our homes and our towns and snatching our children away from us, never to be seen again. But because he was birthed from the internet, many of the people most likely to consume Slender content back in the day were children and young adults. And I should know, I was 9 years old when the Slenderman first debuted online, and for a while in 4th grade, I was absolutely obsessed with and terrified of him. The Slenderman is an example of something known colloquially on the internet as creepypasta. The name comes from the term copy-pasta, aka stories and passages of text that have become mimetic via copy-pasting around the internet. A good example of a copy-paste still in circulation is the Navy SEAL rant, where someone on a forum or in a comment section will fight with whoever pedantically challenges their opinions or perspectives by copy-pasting a pre-written rant about how they're a big, strong Navy SEAL who has been involved in, and I quote, numerous raids on Al-Qaeda and has over 300 confirmed kills. The term guerrilla warfare, as in the animal, is used pretty prominently in some versions of the copy-paste, and I honestly live for it. How Darmanitan of them, that big, strong Navy SEAL. Creepypasta are basically campfire horror stories that have been copy-pasted around the internet. To paraphrase PonyTuber and creepypasta aficionado Jenny Nicholson, they're what you read when you outgrow Goosebumps but aren't quite old enough to get into Stephen King. I read a lot of these in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, as by that point I felt I was ready for something a bit more mature than The Werewolf of Fever Swamp. And I remember those years specifically being my creepypasta years because by middle school I had been reading Carrie and Salem's Lot. And for reference, I'm currently going through my Pasolini phase. Creepypastas came in a few different varieties, or flavors if we want to take it there. There were your standard horror stories, sometimes accompanied by creepy photoshopped images. Jeff the Killer and the Russian Sleep Experiment are two really good examples of this. Good meaning they fit the description, that's not a marker of quality. There are also those that are based on existing media. Most famous were the lost episodes, usually of shows made for children, because that's scary, as well as haunted video game cartridges. Lost episode creepypastas were usually pretty samey. You'd have things like Squidward's Suicide, Suicide Mouse, which was about Mickey Mouse, Dead Bart. You get the point. Relying on the reader's nostalgia for the series in question, the stories typically revolved around one of the main characters dying either on accident or more frequently via suicide, and the rest of the characters grieving in really prolonged and unpleasant scenes. A weird trope that was in a lot of these stories was hyper-realistic eyeballs. Usually the dead character would have a scene where they'd look into the camera with these hyper-realistic eyes, which would then in turn compel the viewer to throw up or hang themselves. I guess this is what Jack Thompson is warning us about. Video game stories were a lot more freeform, if not just because the different games covered allowed for different avenues to be explored. Ben Drowned is easily the most iconic of this whole genre, but I personally was more into Lavender Town Syndrome and Polybius. I didn't have a lot of friends in the 4th grade, so these sorts of stories were how I spent a lot of my time as a kid. I didn't have a lot of friends when I was younger. No way. Yeah, it's so hard to see why. Reusable straw, 'cause I love the environment. Thanks, Bronx Zoo. There were a lot of creepypastas that featured Slenderman. It's hard to give specific examples, but one I remember pretty well is from 2010 that has a picture of a girl and Slenderman holding hands in the forest. This was really the story that sort of cemented Slenderman in the public consciousness, as before then, most of the content being made about him was from small YouTube channels, like this one, trying to uncover the truth about this fictional campfire monster. Well, I guess it's not entirely true, but I'll get to that in a minute. Oh, speaking of mistruths, I have to address something. During the Carrie video, I talked about the ending of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and it turns out I was misremembering things because I described the ending as cutting to black, when in actuality, Norman's face briefly fades into his mother's mummified face before the scene transitions to Marion's car being fished out of the swamp. I don't know why I misremembered it, but maybe I was just thinking about how I would have ended it. Either way, I realized my mistake as I was pulling footage for the Carrie video, but I'm lazy and hate re-recording anything, so I guess you'll just have to live with it. Consider this my formal, written apology. Back to the video. Something that was really important to the culture of creepypasta was, as you can surely imagine, the OCs. Slenderman, Jeff the Killer, Mr. Bear. Creepypasta introduced the world to a bunch of really cool and interesting horror monsters, and more importantly, it gave people a lot of cool, edgy cosplay ideas for horror conventions. Suddenly you'd see Elvira posing with a guy dressed up as Mr. Widemouth when previously he'd been dressed up as Cujo. I don't know if that's ever happened, I just really hope it has. Slenderman's success as an OC led to a drive in internet goers to create the next big creepypasta monster. In the months and years following, we would get things like Jeff the Killer, Jane the Killer, the Skin Taker, and all the various SCPs. The boldest of creators, however, just did their own take on Slenderman. Even mainstream writers got in on it, with the guys at Supernatural dedicating an episode of season 9 to their own version called The Thin Man. Merriam-Webster was working really hard that day coming up with all those synonyms. There was also an episode of SVU based on the Slender Stabbings about a fictional comic book character called Glasgow Man, who in the episode goes on to inspire a real-life crime. Just like the Slender Man did. But wait, Slender Stabbings? You mean he's real? No, of course not. He's not real, but his influence as a pop culture icon is. And in 2014, 2 girls who were reportedly obsessed with Slender Man stabbed their younger friend 19 times in a park, supposedly believing he was instructing them to do it. Both girls were later caught and institutionalized, and the victim miraculously survived. The whole situation was really sad and upsetting, especially to the families of those involved, and the whole thing really soured the internet on Slenderman and creepypasta in general, although he had already become a stale meme at that point. Since the incident, the survivor has spoken to a few media outlets, and the whole situation has apparently inspired her to pursue a career in medicine. So, at the very least, some good did come out of it. Hollywood, being Hollywood, obviously wanted to capitalize on the press the character was receiving, so in 2018, 4 years after the stabbing, Sony Pictures released Slenderman, which bombed. It currently has an 8% on Rotten Tomatoes, and I honestly think that score is a bit charitable to the film's quality as a whole. To quote David Ehrlich of IndieWire, the film aspires to be for the YouTube era what The Ring was to the last gasps of the VHS generation. But there's one fundamental difference that sets the two movies apart. The Ring is good, and Slenderman is terrible. An accurate summation if ever I've heard one. Obviously, Hollywood was not the first to capitalize in Slendermania. In fact, the character has inspired a whole host of derivative works, with everything from fan art to fan fiction to cosplays and comic books coming out of this little horror internet meme. The real stars of the show, however, were the Slender series, pretty much all of which were/are hosted on YouTube. Before we get into the real meat and potatoes of this video's main subject, I'd like to spend a moment of our fabulous but fleeting time together discussing the series that really put Slenderman on the map and cemented his place in our collective cultural consciousness. The web series that changed the way we interact with found footage stories. The web series that defied expectation. Okay, that's enough. So, as a bit of preamble to the main event, let's talk about Marble Hornets. The year is 2009. Barack Obama has just been sworn in for his first term, Greenland has won the right to self-rule from Denmark, and a small file-sharing website called YouTube has begun to pick up steam. Dominated by the likes of faceless Let's Players and pink frosted sprinkled donuts eating comedians, the culture of YouTube is one of amateurism and manic, fun energy, not yet killed by the legion of video game screamer adders and vloggers that would invade the platform only a few years later. Looking back through the lens of our post-YouTube premium, mid-budget action comedies starring some flavor of Paul, Marble Hornets starts off pretty humbly, you could say. A guy named Jay begins piecing together what happened during the production of a student film called Marble Hornets, created by his friend Alex, who, after canceling the project, dropped a bunch of tapes at his feet along with instructions never to contact him again. Alex has disappeared, Jay has all these tapes, and on them he finds what appears to be months of documented encounters with a being known as the Operator, which is MH's take on the Slenderman. It's a really beefy series, and a lot of stuff happens in it, so I won't go into too much depth here. For more info on Marble Hornets, I've linked an excellent video on the series by Session Jam that was really helpful in writing this portion of the video in the description below. Nightmind also has a deep dive into each of MH's 3 seasons, so check those out if you're a fan of his, or if you just have a lot of time on your hands, I guess. For the purposes of this video, what you need to know is that Marble Hornets, in addition to kicking off the trend of found footage style Slender stories, really cemented most of the common tropes we associate with the character now. MH was the first to do the staticky distortion of the camera's audio and video, and it created what's known in the Slender fandom as Slender sickness, a fictitious illness with symptoms that progressively worsen with each encounter. When you're just starting out being stalked, one can expect to experience nosebleeds as well as mild amnesia and flu-like symptoms. After your first encounter with the Slenderman, however, you experience nausea, vomiting, strong cough, bleeding, as well as mild radiation poisoning and déjà vu, according to the wiki, that is. After a while, the bleeding becomes more severe, and you start to experience severe convulsions and memory loss, as well as difficulty swallowing. Good to know I'm not being stalked by the Slenderman. A lot of these tropes are pretty common, not just amongst creepypasta, but horror in general. Remember that thing about the hyper-realistic eyeballs making you want to hurl? In the Slender canon, Slender sickness is caused by an energy he gives off called sigma radiation, which is just shorthand for bad vibes in this universe, I guess, when the vibrations are so negative that you start convulsing in your own home. I don't even need a Slenderman for that. Obviously, sigma radiation is not a real thing. I assume the guy who came up with it read one Hulk book and thought the idea sounded cool. Oh, who am I kidding? He probably didn't even read the comic. His friend forced him to sit through Infinity War, and he just got the rest through osmosis. Not to gatekeep the Hulk, though, I have no strong feelings about the character. What am I talking about? MH's influence can't really be understated. Other than, like, Lonely Girl 15, a series of this scale hadn't really been attempted on YouTube before, and it drew a lot of new viewers to the platform. The creative team behind it has tried to keep the franchise going since its conclusion in 2014. A film adaptation called Always Watching, a Marble Hornets story was released in 2015. It has a 27% on Rotten Tomatoes, the same score as the theatrical cut of Batman v Superman, and it deserves it. The team also made a couple of follow-up series titled Clear Lakes 44 and ECVA, but both failed to really take off in the way the original did, and Clear Lakes fizzled out after the creative team parted ways. Still, it's crazy how a YouTube series from 2009 whose first season was produced on a budget of $500 could so ingrain both itself and this character in our cultural consciousness. The Slender fandom is not nearly as active today as it was in its heyday, but at its peak, you couldn't go anywhere on YouTube without being bombarded by theory videos, story narrations, and derivative works. Marble Hornets was, again, the real trendsetter here, and it set the stage for many works inspired by not just Slenderman, but the mythos established by MH itself. Everything from Minecraft to Slender the 8 Pages to, yes, 2018 Slenderman have taken inspiration specifically from this one show. Troy Wagner, who played the lead Jay and also created and wrote the show, is still active online, and it's clear he still loves the show and all the works and community that have come out of it. He's one of those early YouTube success stories that found their audience before creators could rack up millions of views on storytime videos. So it's a testament to Marble Hornets' quality that in the 12 years since its debut, it's managed to pull in similar numbers. And it's fun to look back and have this a time capsule to before YouTube was owned by Google and everyone needed a Patreon in order to make any money off of this website. In 2010, about a year into its run, Marble Hornets was starting to really pick up steam. Viewers really gravitated towards the slow burn style of storytelling that lent itself well to long gaps between episodes. One thing was clear, there was an audience for long-form, low-budget horror stories putting their own spin on the Slenderman mythos. Enter Jeffrey Koval, Evan Jennings, and Vincent Caffarello, who would go on to create what would become the second most successful Slender series on YouTube. EverymanHYBRID first began life presenting as a low-budget health and fitness program designed to teach the everyman how to get in shape while on a budget. Although I don't want to oversell the show, as it was very much a pastiche of that whole genre of lifestyle show that, well, certainly a thing back then, has sort of been lost to time as YouTube has been invaded by brands, ads, and other professional level productions. The joke in the first few episodes is that all the advice given in the show is terrible and or wrong and or just common sense stuff like eat green veggies to up your green veggie intake. Thanks, Evan. The presentation is earnest enough that I could buy it as a small project being put together on a whim by 3 hobbyists who also happened to be friends in real life, which, you know, it was. It's my impression that all 3 boys put in a balanced amount of work plotting out the story and writing the individual episodes, and from their strong concept proven by the subtle Easter eggs present all the way back since the first episode, it's clear that they had a certain level of intelligence going into the series. EverymanHYBRID primarily centers around 3 boys: Vinny, the show's protagonist, Evan, the show's nutritional correspondent, and Jeff, who's in charge of camera and editing and is also, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, best boy. From the first episode, there are little nods to MH, whether it's in the little mannequin statuette behind Vinny or the distorted cut to a creepy shot of the woods after the credits. Some episodes, they'll even have a guy dressed up in a dollar store Slenderman costume standing menacingly in the distance, along with some amateur distortion effects to really sell the slender of it all. This is all part of the pastiche, as in-universe, the characters, Jeff, Evan, and Vinny, are slipping in little Easter eggs to celebrate their love of Marble Hornets. MH even gets name-dropped after another Slenderman shows up, but they don't know who it is, and they think it's just some guy who broke into Evan's house, and they have to put out a video saying, "Please don't break into Evan's house, please. Slenderman is not real." Funny that. I want to make it clear at the outset that when I talk about Jeff, Evan, and Vinny, I'm talking about the in-universe characters and not the real-life boys who portray them. When I do talk about the real life boys, I'll stop and clarify, because up until 2017 in interviews and fan interactions, they never broke character. There's this really well-known interview where one EMH viewer is super stoked to meet and talk to these guys for his channel and ask them about how they manage all these cool visuals and audio effects on such a small budget. And this poor man has to try and haggle information out of his idols while they faff about and pretend they're really being stalked by this slenderman. Jeff fakes a phone call and the two of them leave early, and this sweet young man is left in the dust to wonder whether they're just fucking with him or if they've gone mad and actually believe Slenderman is real and this is all actually happening.
So you're telling me this is real?
There was no jump in technology. We didn't get better at anything. It happened to us. We have, I don't know, we called it or some.
The whole charade was sustainable for so long because not only are the characters based on the actors who portrayed them, for the most part, but the people they're based on also happen to just be normal dudes, so if ever they needed to stop and address something, they could do it in character. My favorite moment of this is back in 2011. During an impromptu fan meetup, Evan called one of his friends, I think it was Jeff, queer, prompting a bit of comment section discourse. Jeff tweeted out an apology for the incident, explaining how they're all a product of the public school system before immediately jumping right back into the ARG and telling everyone to send them good vibes to a character who got into a car crash at the end of the episode. Wait, what? ARG? What are you talking about? This wasn't in Marble Hornets. That's right, fellas. I buried the lead. What really set Everyman Hybrid apart from the likes of Marble Hornets or Tribe 12 was the ARG elements. Now, most of my time as a hybrid took place back during their heyday when I was in the 6th grade, and as an 11-year-old in Washington State, I didn't really have the resources to hoof it out to New Jersey and participate in the ARG, and I was also too young to be on Twitter, so my EMH experience was strictly limited to what was posted on their YouTube channel. Every few months they'd drop a video and I'd be stoked to see some guy get messed up by my favorite creepypasta monster, only to be completely lost when they would be breaking their friend out of a mental hospital or opening a letter that they tweeted about finding the week before. Most of the ARG elements took the form of Twitter and Tumblr posts because apparently the Slenderman has really good reception out in the woods where he slices up his victims. Twitter was the place where you'd go to keep up with the boys, but a lot of the really interesting behind-the-scenes stuff happened over on Tumblr on blogs run by Evan and another character, whomst we'll discuss in a minute. The tangible ARG bits came in the form of boxes the three boys would plant in and around their home state of New Jersey. In some of the videos, there would be pieces of coordinates, and when assembled after the fact, fans would be able to drive to the coordinates and find a box containing clues to unraveling the series' big mystery. Many of these clues were pretty abstract, leaving room for a lot of theorizing and thus creating more and more fan engagement. From what I understand, the ARG elements were what really hooked fans on the series as a whole, and fan efforts would then be rewarded by videos posted on the channel adding to the mystery and or confirming their fan theories. Now, I don't know much about ARGs or the online horror community, but I have spent enough time in the Drag Race fandom to know that online communities are exceptional at picking up breadcrumbs and seeing where the trail leads. With this in mind, I can imagine the pressure these boys felt to keep upping the ante as the series went on and its popularity and fandom continued to grow. This is just speculation, but I'd imagine that pressure is what led to the series sort of going off the rails a few years in. But I'll get to that when I talk about the series Big Bad. As previously stated, the show's three main boys are Vinny, Evan, and Jeff. While the show starts off splitting the screen time between each boy with their own arcs and side objectives complicating the main show, as time goes on, Vinny is pretty firmly cemented as the protagonist and audience surrogate, and Evan is clearly defined as the main antagonist. Well, kind of. Their dynamic is what really sells the show because as an ARG, there wasn't much room for a tightly woven narrative. It was often the character interactions and conflicts that propelled the story forward, which can, in theory, be good, so long as you generally know where your story is going. Evan is the group's sort of loose cannon character, the powerhouse, if you will. He's the beefiest boy with the brashest personality, and as such is primed from the start to be possessed by the show's demon monster OC and become a sexy bad boy serial killer. He's an edgy boy who loves melee weapons, and he has this band tee and blue jeans aesthetic that makes me very happy personally. Throughout the show, his main arcs revolve around his blooming relationship with Steph, more on her in a sec, and his serial killer alter ego named Habit, so named for the Animal Collective song Who Could Win a Rabbit, the refrain repeating the line, rabbit or a habit or a rib. In a show supposedly about the Slender Man, Evan ends up being the catalyst for most of the show's conflict. A lot of it happens, however, while he isn't in full control of his body, so much of his own internal conflict comes from the inner turmoil he feels sharing a body with a malicious entity out to kill all of his friends. The cameraman and best boy, Jeff, is responsible for most of the show's action early on. The first major plot beat in the show is the disappearance of his girlfriend, Jessa, followed by a failed rescue attempt involving the tracking down of a guy named Dr. Korenthal. Remember that name, because he's about to get real confusing. Compared to Evan, who even before being possessed had this pseudo-serial killer-esque edgy boy personality, and Vinny, who, as the audience surrogate, was never anything more than a boring piece of man, Jeff's personality is more demure. He comes off as the most thoughtful and introspective of the group, yet, as the cameraman, also the quietest. Whereas Evan says the quiet part loud, Jeff tends to keep all of his emotions close to his chest, as seen when he shoots off to find his missing girlfriend without so much as a word to his two closest friends. This is just a side note, but throughout the show, Jeff's accent is pretty inconsistent. At first it sounds pretty neutral American, not really Jersey at all, but as the show goes on, his speaking gets more relaxed and he starts to sound a little twangy.
We apologize if it's hard to follow what's going on, but we don't know what's going on as well. So, like I said, there's been a bunch of packages and letters and other content directed towards us or involving us that's scattered on.
It's not quite Southern, but it's definitely noticeable, and it's not shared by anyone else, so something tells me it was just a byproduct of the actor getting more comfortable on camera. Most of Jeff's drama as a character revolves around his experiences with grief. Prior to the first episode, Jeff's parents drowned after driving their car off a bridge, and because this is a Slender show, Slenderman is later implicated in their death. He's then forced to take on a surrogate father role to his little brother, an already monumental task compounded by the loss of his girlfriend and all the supernatural goings-on around him. He's essentially this show's Elena Gilbert, only instead of pining over two sexy vampire brothers, I wish, Jeff spends most of his time investigating the curious case of Dr. Korenthal and taking care of his little brother Alex. Alex gets his own section, so I'm not really gonna talk much about him here. Then we have Vinny. It's obvious looking back on the first episode that Vinny was always pegged as the audience surrogate. The show is called EverymanHYBRID, and Vinny, the only boy to appear in the first episode, introduces himself as Vinny Everyman. That's obviously not his real last name, but I'm unsure if the characters have last names or if their last names are just their actors' last names. The fandom seems pretty split on this, but as far as the ARG goes, it's safe to assume that Everyman is just shorthand for audience surrogate. They also call their fans hybrids in the show, something that is mocked by the other characters for being oh so lame. So there's that. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Vinny in this video because back in September of last year, an Anon on Tumblr came forward with allegations that Vinny had groomed and solicited nude photos from them when they were 15. I don't know how real these screenshots are, or whether that account in Snapchat is still active, or if it ever even belonged to him. All I know is that the post hasn't gained much traction in the months it's been up, as the EMH fandom has been pretty inactive since the show's end in 2018. Vinny did, however, consent to the conversation being screenshotted, and the Anon has not backed down from their allegations in the face of scrutiny. It's always my policy to believe victims, and I went back and forth on whether or not I should even make this video at all in light of these allegations. However, as a longtime fan of Jeff and Evan and everyone else who worked on the show, I've decided to truck on, while keeping all Vinny posting to a minimum. As far as I'm aware, none of the boys have commented on the situation, and given the lack of traction, I'm not even sure whether or not the real-life Jeff or Evan know about the situation, so if anything, I'm hoping that this video can boost these things to the point where the boys have no choice but to address it. A long shot for a channel as small as this, but hey, stranger things have happened. So, like I said, no more Vinny posting. Let's get back to the show. Moving on, we have Jeff's girlfriend, Jessa. As her disappearance and presumed death are the first major plot beats in the show, she's only in a few episodes towards the series beginning. I don't know, she seems sweet, but we don't really learn anything about her besides the fact that she and Jeff met in high school and that she's close friends with another main character. Back during the early days, the cast would often go live on a service called Ustream in character and talk to fans. In one of these, Jeff showed off an amulet that he was going to give to Jessa, only for it to come back later on in a main channel video as what was supposed to be a big mic drop reveal, implying that she'd been killed by the Slenderman. It's a payoff to seeds that, in my opinion, were planted very shallowly beforehand, and the necklace's discovery doesn't offer a whole lot of closure on her character, especially since they find it in a location that hadn't ever been seen or mentioned up to that point. I think that lack of closure is what the team was going for, but it just fell a little flat for me personally. Ustream, for those curious, was a sort of proto-Twitch, and it's since been purchased by IBM and turned into a cloud service. But all of the streams, as far as I know, have been archived on YouTube. The streams are fun because their length really gives us time to understand the dynamic between these three boys. It's implied that, despite being close with him, Jeff and Vinny are kinda weirded out by Evan's more off-kilter persona. Boy, were they not ready for what he had in store later on. Especially Jeff. The last main character is Stephanie, who was responsible for most of the ARG's activity on Tumblr back in the day, initially posting under the alias of Damsel. She even had a few interactions with the boys that made it into the videos, as well as a public Twitter fight with Jeff that I'm sure must have been very surreal to watch unfold in real time. She got added into the main cast in her own video, titled Damsel. The boys break her out of the psychiatric hospital where she's being treated, and Jeff ends up football tackling a guard. It's a really well done episode, but all it does now is remind me of that scene in The Invisible Man.
I see you! I see you!
Her backstory involves Slenderman killing her family and cutting them up into pieces, tying their remains up in garbage bags and stringing them up in the woods because he has no chill. She gets involved in the plot early on when she befriends Jessa and is implicated in her disappearance by Jeff. Eventually, however, she and the boys become friends and she even begins dating, or at the very least sleeping with, Evan. We'll get to that. I guess if I had to define each of the characters in terms of RPG/anime roles, Vinny would be the hero, Evan would be the powerhouse, and also the Lancer too, I guess. Jeff would be the brains, and Steph would be the heart. Although you could honestly make the case for the other way around, since both Steph and Jeff have similar trajectories on the show. What I mean to say is that for the first year of the show, the main channel was defined almost entirely by the dynamic between the three boys and how they dealt with the supernatural goings-on around them, and Steph definitely shook that up in a really cool and transformative way. These shows did have a tendency to fridge their female characters way more often than their male counterparts, so to have a main cast member like Steph stick around for as long as she did was a breath of fresh air. Too bad she couldn't have stuck around for longer, but I get the sense that her actress was feeling a bit stilted, especially considering her reduced appearances in the months leading up to her character's death. Dr. Corenthal! Dr. Corenthal. Where do I even begin with Dr. Corenthal? Well, in 1962, the town of Centralia, Pennsylvania was mostly abandoned after a coal mine caught fire and destroyed most of the residents' livelihood. Currently, Centralia is mostly a ghost town and the fire still burns to this day, but in-universe, 4 children were orphaned and taken in by a man named Dr. James Corenthal, whose wife, Mary Ann, was tracked down by Jeff during the search for Jessa. I think. The Dr. Corenthal stuff is easily the most confusing in the entire series, but what you need to know right now is that he adopted the kids, whom he refers to as the Mining Town 4, in the 80s and has been their surrogate father ever since. Dr. Corenthal exists in EMH less as a character and more as a plot point. His presence is felt, but it's clear throughout that whatever his deal is, everything with him went down way before the series began. Jessie is Dr. Corenthal's half-niece, Evan's ex-girlfriend, and close friend of the whole crew. And yes, there's a Jessa and a Jessie. It caused a lot of confusion for me as a kid, but they're very different characters, so it works. Jessie is to Evan what Jessa was to Jeff, both in narrative utility and presentation. Her major purpose in the show is to connect the dots between the boys and Dr. Corenthal, but she's also implicated in the plot line that really turned me on to the show back when I was a kid. Alex is Jeff's little brother and proxy kid brother of the whole friend group. He's like the Keldio / Frankie Jonas of the group. He's introduced pretty early on as Jeff's surrogate child, traumatized more outwardly than Jeff by their parents' death and generally needing to be taken care of. He has a little dog named Sparky, who is honestly the cutest dog I've ever seen in my life. And throughout the series, Alex becomes more and more unhinged from reality. In one episode, he refuses to go to the library with Vinny and Jeff because a recording of his dead mom tells him it's too late to go out. Jeff refuses to help him seek treatment because, in Evan's words, they'll lock him up or just take him away. Point blank, Jeff and Alex have the most interesting dynamic on the show. Every time Alex does something concerning, Jeff will usher him out of the room in a hushed manner. And in one of the videos on his channel, Alex calls Jeff a psycho because he doesn't believe in the Slenderman. What a fool. Alex doesn't believe in the Slenderman, Jeff does. I really love all of their interactions, but it seems like Alex eventually got tired of the show because he gets killed off pretty unceremoniously about 2 years in. During his run, Alex had his own channel where he would document the other side of the EMH crew's exploits, as well as chronicle his own journey with the mysterious entity known as the Rake. That's right, bitches. It's time to talk about the Rake! Those familiar with this side of me know that one of my all-time favorite creepypastas is The Rake, a story about a pale, golem-like creature with razor-sharp claws that waits at the edge of its victims' beds at night before it slices them up. It's a perfect campfire story because there's just enough of a pop culture frame of reference for this kind of character to be feasible in the mind of a child. The Rake still lives rent-free in my head because, unlike Slenderman, it hasn't been deluged by overexposure in the time since its debut, and the original story is told epistolary style, giving it a bit of an identity. There was a small indie film about the Rake, which I loved. It came out the same year as Slenderman, and it's just as much of a cheesy monster movie schlock fest as I'd hoped. I first found EMH while searching the web for any and all Rake-related content. In the show, the Rake spends most of his time stalking Alex and hiding out in his closet. A metaphor if ever I've heard one. True to the original story, he is a pale, golem-like humanoid who crawls on all fours and slices people up, and most of Alex's arc revolves around his various encounters with the Rake, including one which leaves his dog dead and Evan seriously wounded. Jessie is targeted by the Rake because of her relationship to her grandmother Rose, whom he spent the last few years tormenting. Because this is Everyman Hybrid, everything is super vague, but the long and short is that sometime after taking in the mining town 4, the Corenthals took in a young patient of his named Linny. Linny and Rose are both characters in the original Rake story, so for a die-hard fan like me, it's nice to see the boys staying so true to the source material. The Rake has been stalking Linny for quite some time, and he's first seen during the search for Jessa when the crew finds a dead body in Jeff's old, burned-out elementary school. The dead body is heavily implied to be Linny. The note they find in her hand is addressed to an unknown person, but it's been signed by Linny herself. Linny, Rose, and William all have some relation to the narrator of the first note from the original Rake story, and from what I've gathered from my various MH viewings, I've pieced this together. The Rake was stalking Linny, whose birth mother had been tormented by it for some time. It was also stalking Rose and William, who were either A, Linny's real parents, or B, friends of the family. Either way, the Rake ended up killing Linny, Rose, and eventually Jessie, as seen in the episode Jim Thorpe. Now, back to Alex. Alex's relationship with the Rake is very true to the meat and potatoes of the original story. The Rake sits at his bedside and whispers horrible things to him, presumably about his family and friends, before slicing him up and hiding in the crawl space in his closet. Or does he? Evan and Jeff investigate the crawl space only to find themselves in a basement at Baldpate Mountain, a recurring location for the series. They then return home only to find the crawl space has vanished and Alex is later killed by either the Rake or Slenderman on the way to Jessie's funeral. Alex as a character is what we in the business call wasted potential. On my most recent rewatch, I was disappointed by the lack of time or care taken by the show in delving into and dissecting Alex's degrading psychological state. You'd get little scenes and bits where Alex would do something concerning, like build a sock puppet and pretend it's his dead dog. Or there'd be a short scene of Jeff in his car talking about how hard it is to take care of him and how he can't be a father to him. But these moments would never last. Very few, very far between, and just as you think they're about to break some new ground with Alex, boom, he's dead. And we're left with Vinny all bloody on the ground and Slenderman just chilling out in the distance. This is something I see a lot in horror media, not just in fan works and amateur productions, but also in big budget films and television shows. They'll be right on the cusp of greatness, just about to strike gold with one of their most interesting themes or characters, only to sweep the rug out from under you for shock value. EMH made heavy use of this tactic, and it got to the point around 2013 where they'd killed off most of their interesting characters, so we're just left with Vinny Everyman and evil bad boy Evan just chilling on the couch being bad. This disposability of interesting characters like Alex and Steph really hurt the show in the long run. As the core cast got smaller and smaller and characters whose arcs we'd spent a lot of time with paid off and not at all, the show began to feel a lot more insular and the pacing really dragged as a result. This was around the time they began experimenting with longer form episodes that all revolved around Evan's superpowered alter ego Habit, so depending on how you feel about the character, your mileage will vary. Personally, I didn't get much at all out of these years of the show, as what attracted me to EMH in the first place was the large cast and creepypasta murder mysteries. This was also around the time when the ARG elements really started to slow down. Most of the characters were dead, so Twitter feuds were difficult, and what remained were Habit's little online tirades, so nothing short of making Slenderman a Twitter account would have revitalized it, and they had already tried that.
Take solace in the rain, my children. It only means I'm near.
They also seemingly abandoned the box thing for a few years there. There were supposed to be 7 in total, but there was about a 6-year gap between the 6th and 7th being found, when before they were being picked up left and right. So it's pretty clear that they just either A, forgot, or B, lost interest. They eventually distributed the last box, but by that point, I was pretty burned out, so I can't even remember what was in it. Inside the briefcase was a lockbox, an answering machine, a spool of purple thread, a pocket knife, a rabbit plushie that had been stitched up with purple thread, and a padded envelope. Dixie Wolf used the knife to open the stitched up rabbit plushie and found the key to the lockbox in a Ziploc bag. The lockbox contained 2 tapes for the answering machine labeled Tape 3 and House Phone 2005, a USB drive containing 18 audio files for Tape 3 available on YouTube, a shotgun shell casing believed to be the one Alex buried as part of the 7 trials, and a small pocket watch stopped at 2:12. The envelope contained the following: a Polaroid picture with a sticky note on the back labeling it James Elizabeth Adam, a burnt bookmark from Labyrinth Books on the back dates 1589, 1888, 1929, 1971, 1989, 1990, question mark 1991, and a bunch of fake news articles providing exposition to an 8-year-old alternate reality game. As impressed as I was at the beginning of my most recent EMH binge at just how meticulously planned out this whole story was from the beginning, as I watched on, it slowly dawned on me that that wasn't really the case at all. Back when the show was actually about Slenderman, you got the sense that this was the show these guys set out to make from the beginning. 3 boys and their outer circle come into contact with creepypasta monsters while also dealing with a malevolent force that communicates using social media. Got it. Yes, I am here for this. As the show went on, however, new plot elements were added, important characters got killed off left and right, and every potential plot hole or inconsistency could be explained away with, oh, they're just stuck in a time loop, or, oh, there's that Habit again, up to all his old tricks. And it got to a point where the show was starting to feel like a waste of time. Obviously, I speak for no one other than myself, but I got burnt out on the show relatively quickly. I watched it all over the course of a few days using a very handy playlist created by presumably a fan that included all of the extant material and fan submissions, and I kept up very closely with the timeline provided by the wiki, just to make sure that I didn't miss out on anything. Then, after I was done, I watched all 13 hours of Nightmind's years-old breakdown of the entire show, episode by episode, post by post, tweet by tweet, And that definitely helped me understand what at that point was all blurring together into an amorphous blob akin to the narrator at the end of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. What I'm saying is that at this point, I should be a certified EMH expert. But even with all of that time, even with every post-show Q&A and interview with the cast reminiscing about the show's production, I still feel like an amateur. Writing this, I truthfully can't remember why Vinny went to that old hospital or why he and Habit killed each other at the end of the penultimate episode. Partway through a late series episode, Dr. Korenthal appears and opens a portal to another dimension. And then the three boys work to stop Habit from destroying the universe. I think. That's just my delirious interpretation, because at this point, what had started out as a meta-narrative about a group of friends fighting the Slenderman has become an inscrutable collection of scenes that my brain can't even begin to parse through. Just thinking about it makes me feel tired. You want to see my conspiracy board? It's all over there just to plot out what this thing feels like to even try and piece together. One of EMH's greatest stylistic inspirations is a book called House of Leaves, a horror story that, on the surface, is a pseudo-documentary about a house that's impossibly big on the inside. As the novel goes on, the narration becomes inscrutable, and the style of writing devolves into chaos. It's a genuinely chilling read, and its particular brand of buck wild is one that can only really be effectively captured through the medium of writing, because it forces your brain to try and make sense of the information using your imagination and what little's written on the page. A common philosophy among horror writers is that the withholding of information creates a scarier consumer experience because it forces your brain to fill in the gaps. Whatever the consumer's mind creates is scarier to them than anything the writer could come up with, creating a more memorable and rewarding consumer experience. This kind of storytelling, when predicated on the withholding of information, is incredibly hard to pull off in a visual medium because the advent of visual and audio input comes with a much greater capacity for collecting information. A good example of this style of storytelling done well on screen is Trey Edward Scholl's It Comes at Night, a psychological horror film about a family holed up in a cabin in the woods after the earth is plagued with a deadly virus. Scholl's never condescends to his audience with exposition, nor does he even show what it is that comes at night. We get hints of it through the emaciated remains of our lead's grandfather at the beginning, as well as what happens to the family dog after it runs off, but we never actually learn what it is that comes at night. What little information we get tells us exactly what we need to know. Why is this family holed up? Why do they spend so much of the film utterly terrified? What does this thing that comes at night do, exactly? It's the perfect scenario to drive what actually matters to the film's narrative. The human drama stemming from interpersonal conflict as two families attempt to share their space and resources. It's the subtleties that really sell the story, as seen in the dad's palpable fear response after his son runs off after the dog. EverymanHYBRID puts the B in subtle, and nothing better exemplifies that problem than Habit. Evan acts the way he does because there's a rabbit demon living in his head rent-free, and that demon's name is Habit. Remember what I said about creepypasta writers creating their own OCs? It's never specified what kind of entity Habit is or whether or not he has a true corporeal form, but he does at one point take credit for the killings of Ed Gein and Jack the Ripper, implying that he's been jumping around from host to host throughout time like the Nogitsune in Season 3 of Teen Wolf. Now, Habit is really popular with the fandom. He seems to be most people's favorite character and probably the reason why so many people keep coming back. That being said, I'm not really going to hold back my feelings. Habit just doesn't do it for me. He seems to fall into a certain genre of horror villain that I'm generally not a fan of. The charismatic, darkly charming twunk who also happens to be a sadistic serial killer who's so evil that any ounce of humanity flees into the night from anyone who even dares associate with him. Welcome to his world of fun. Not to bring up Teen Wolf twice in one video, but he does give off very Nogitsune meets Theo Rakin vibes. Just a happy-go-lucky serial killer with a lust for bloodshed and a grabby hand. What really cements Habit as such a prime example of this trope is the sheer level of depravity the writers take his character to. Hey, you want to know how Steph dies? Steph, one of our leads at this point, who has been involved with the ARG aspects of the series since before even the Jessa arc, is forced to watch as Evan, possessed by Habit, kills and eats her infant child. That's right. There's a scene where Evan kills and eats his own baby under Habit's control before murdering the mother of his own child, who, I repeat, he ate on camera while forcing the mother to watch.
I adopted these 3 needy drag babies, and Derek Barry only had 1 baby for breakfast.
And then he fucks off for a while and Evan kills the rake before then heading over to Vinny's house and sitting on his couch watching TV for the rest of the year. And of course the fandom ate him up. Young adults, specifically those with an affinity for genre fiction, are obsessed with these dark, twisted bad boys with big personalities who commit atrocities in the name of achieving their goals. Kylo Ren, literally Space Hitler, is one that comes to mind. Loki, Mr. He killed 80 people in 2 days, is also up there. And that's not to say that it's necessarily wrong to enjoy characters like this. Remember, this is fiction, and much better to explore these ideas through fiction than going out into the world and eating a fucking baby. We can't all be Evie Oddly.
I spent a lifetime honing a very bold voice, so I've been learning how to communicate in a more approachable way.
But to be so enraptured by the character that you design and sell t-shirts and coffee stickers that say, "I eat babies" on them, just strikes me as a bit odd. And I actually want to take this moment to give a huge shout out to Evan's actor, Evan Jennings, because for as fucked up as the scene in question is, he sells the fuck out of it. I don't think Habit would have caught on like wildfire if he had been played by anyone else, because Jennings really just takes it there in a way I'm comfortable saying the others probably wouldn't have been able to. Like I said, the characters are based on the actors, so Evan's edgy boy, loves knives, carries a hatchet to the grocery store persona is definitely inspired by the actor's own personality. As far as I know, none of the people in this show were accomplished actors before its start, but hell, I'm ready to cast Evan in something right now. I think he'd make a really good Shadow the Hedgehog. That's my hot take for the video. Sonic team, pick up the phone. Actually, don't. I don't think I could handle a Shadow renaissance this early on in my career. The Poughkeepsie tapes. Adapt the Poughkeepsie tapes for the stage and cast Evan Jennings as the killer. Mwah! Chef kiss. I think he played the rake too. Maybe he's best boy.
I'm that bad type, make your mama sad type, make your girlfriend mad type, might seduce your dad type. I'm the bad guy. Duh.
What was I saying? Oh, yeah. Habit doesn't work for me because I can't enjoy his fun personality without thinking of the scene where he eats the baby. Call me a plebe, call me a cuck, whatever. I just think it was a little gratuitous and out of place. And I don't think it meshed well with the tone established for the series. It really just soured Habit as a character for me. It doesn't help that right after he eats the baby, he kills Jeff and torches his body. Yeah, I was serious about Steph and Jeff having similar trajectories on the show. He comes back a few times towards the end as a ghost or hallucination or something, but yeah, Jeff dies, and with him I can't help but feel like the heart of the show died too. Like I said before, the heart of EMH really was the friendship between the 3 boys, and Jeff dying and Evan spending most of his time in his Angelus Sona really wrecked that core foundational part of the show, at least in my opinion. Like I said, your mileage may vary. Habit's supposed to be the ultimate master of the universe, with Slenderman and the Rake under his employ, so it makes sense that the show would really zero in on him as a character, but between the show's upending and my general distaste for this kind of character, this was around the time that I really lost interest in the series, only trucking on out of a sense of obligation to the creators. It's like how I'll sometimes go back and binge Red vs. Blue, only to get bored once they reach chorus and stop. This might also just be the nostalgia talking, but I feel like the show is strongest when it was about the Slenderman. The characters were strong, the plot was as tight as it could be, and there were crossovers with other Slender series and creatives, unfortunately including child groomer and creator and star of Tribe 12, Adam Rossner. Jesus, these Slenderman shows just can't catch a break. Well, we'll always have Marble Hornets. One of the most important ARG elements of the show was the 7 Trials of Habit, a tournament-style competition where viewers could submit videos completing various tasks such as burying important objects and going out in public to preach the good word of habit. There are multiple videos of players doing this on YouTube, and they're all incredibly charming. I wish all these people nothing but a good life and happy hunting. In-universe, participants, called Rabbits by Habit, Animal Collective, who failed to complete tasks would be killed by the rake, as seen in what happens to the group's friend Ryan after the fan meetup where Evan calls Jeff a queer. This has to do with those boxes from before, as clues and coordinates, as well as pieces of exposition, could be found with each step. The tournament was updated via Habit's personal Twitter account because, as we've learned, even evil supernatural entities need to keep up with their stands. Fuck it, Habit fan cam. Like I said, I didn't do the ARG. The most the tournament ever comes up in the show is when Jeff scolds Alex for submitting to it on his own channel. Other than that, there's not much to say on it now, as the whole thing's been dead, done, and buried for about 3 years now. Timeline-wise, EMH really fell off after switching to the Habit show. 2010 to 2012, we were getting updates pretty frequently, but from 2013 onward, things really started to slow down. Things got so slow that in 2017, not a single video was uploaded to the main channel. Only a few updates were given to the ARG via Habit's official Twitter account. In-universe, the explanation here is that the Slenderman and Habit have been forcing Vinny to stay in an apartment all by himself with no internet access. How convenient. This is just another example of the boys using paranormal stuff to explain away fan concerns. And as a writer myself, I honestly can't be too mad at it. It's really good shorthand, and given the batshittery of the last few years of the show, it's certainly not out of line. Remember what I said about the boys adding shit in later to explain why nothing in the series makes any sense? Okay, well, maybe that's not fair, but it feels fair. It feels correct, is how it feels. To tie this whole shebang together, the creators came up with the idea that their characters are stuck in a cycle of resurrection, with their lives and fates predetermined to always end the same way. I wonder if that means Evan eats the baby every time. Like most reincarnation stories, the boys have no memories of their past lives under the care of Dr. Corenthal, but there are certain instances where their past lives do pop out. For instance, one day Jessie finds a key in her grandmother's belongings to a storage facility owned by Dr. Corenthal. The gang heads over only for Slenderman to show up and fuck with them. They then get transported back in time, and we see 90s Dr. Corenthal set down a little rocking horse before pulling the door closed. Another time, they pop a video into the player only for the screen to go static, causing them to relive a conversation from a past iteration. I hate how much I like this. It shouldn't work. Based on everything else the series does, all signs point to it not making sense, but it does. There's this whole thing about how Rake Girl is trying to find the EMH gang, and the boys launch an assault on Habit from the spirit realm to try and take him out once and for all. Also, side note, everything in the spirit realm and on Habit's side of things is filmed by a weird creature that doesn't speak because the boys got tired of being stuck to the found footage format and wanted to be all in frame together. It's really cheesy and silly, and it also shouldn't work, but it does. The creature is supposed to be big and built like a dog, but the most we see of it are the characters' reactions to it, all of which are gems. The last episode is a short little reincarnation bit where Vinny is reunited with Evan, Jeff, and Dr. Corenthal in the spirit realm. It's not actually called that, but it's way too cheesy for me to call it anything else. It makes use of this meadow with a tree on Baldpate that's been an important location for the series, and the whole episode is scored by Frank Sinatra's version of We'll Meet Again, tying the whole series up into one purple tape-covered cardboard box. That's a thing Habit does, by the way. Anytime you see something covered in purple tape, Habit did it. Sorry I didn't mention it earlier. You'll just have to make your peace with it, I guess. For fans, I'm sure the finale was a rewarding, if not cathartic, ending, but as someone who was, by that point, very much crawling to the finish line, I didn't really have much of a reaction beyond, they really couldn't get Steph back to complete the set. Huh. So, did it suck? No. No, it didn't suck at all. After my binge and a few months of reflection, I've come to the conclusion that Everyman Hybrid just isn't really for me. I was drawn to the series by the inclusion of one of my all-time favorite creepypasta characters, only to be left with total blue balls when they decided to do fuck all with him. And I know the show wasn't even really about the rake in the first place, but I honestly have a hard time believing that fans who came for the Slender content left particularly satisfied either, as over the course of the later years, he got essentially the same treatment. Your enjoyment of Everyman Hybrid will really vary depending on where you land on the character of Habit. If you dig him and his goofy, twisted serial killer energy, you're gonna get a lot more out of the series than I did. Let's break down the character of Habit, shall we? Character traits include charismatic, effective leader, ate a baby.
Bob the drag queen for president. Why? Because I didn't need a baby.
I said my piece on the character of Habit, so I won't beat a dead horse. All I'll say is that I think the show would have been much stronger had it leaned more into the creepypasta mythos and less into becoming the Habit show. I would have loved to see more campfire monsters show up. Mr. Widemouth is one that comes to mind. He's small, so you could have just used a Furby or something. Truth be told, there aren't a whole lot of creepypasta monsters that lend themselves really well to this kind of story, so I understand why they didn't do this. Let's just all be thankful that Jeff the Killer never came to town for an episode. Ironically, Jeff the character wears a Killer's t-shirt for a few episodes, but that's the most we get. That's subtle. That's a good Easter egg. I wish we'd gotten more of that. Of course, this wasn't just a web series like Marble Hornets or any of its derivatives. EMH was, at its core, an ARG. So while the series does still exist as a fun time capsule to look back on and say, oh, I remember that thing, most of the community-oriented elements that made it famous in the first place are no longer accessible, rendering the whole experience a bit moot, not unlike Diamond and Pearl's event-only locations. This Harbor Inn's been defunct since 2018, and it's safe to say it's staying shut for good. I'm trying really hard not to be too mean with my criticism. Beyond the sheer burnout that comes with watching the same thing for 3 days straight, it was just sad for me to watch a show I loved so much as a kid trudge on for so long past its expiration date. Jeff leaving was really the nail in the coffin, but cards on the table, Alex's death is what really did it for me. The worst part about the whole Alex situation is that his channel isn't even up anymore. EMH's main channel, as well as Habit's Can You See the Words, are both still up, but Alex's personal channel was removed back in 2017 prior to the show's conclusion. I believe the story goes that Alex, who is Jeff's little brother IRL, was concerned about missing out on possible career opportunities because the only things anyone could find out about him online pertained to the series, in which he was both mentally unstable and also deceased. This prompted all of the boys to break character for the first time in 7 years, speaking to an interviewer about the situation during a live stream. Perhaps this was what the series needed to finally wind down. And for what it's worth, the last 5-episode run back in 2018 was probably the best conclusion fans of the series could have hoped for. Each video was about 30 minutes long, which sucked for me, but was awesome for die-hard fans, I'm sure. Most of the top comments in the last few videos are somewhere along the lines of, "Never clicked on a video so fast," "This show saved me," etc, etc, etc. So it's safe to say that most fans of EMH specifically left the party feeling, at the very least, satisfied. And it's not like I didn't enjoy the ride. There were so many fun, unexpected moments along the way, such as one episode that completely follows Habit that features a laugh track and sitcom music as he and his cronies invade a guy's home, or another goofier episode where Vinny finds out that all the boys' houses are one and the same. A late series retcon if ever I've seen one. And it's not like I'm immune to campy horror. AHS is one of my favorite shows on TV, and I was practically raised on Elvira and John Waters. This particular show just didn't do it for me, which is a shame because I remember how invested in it I was when I was young. I was that kid that raced home from the school bus every day to see if maybe, just maybe, there was a new main channel upload. I remember just how batshit insane my friend and I went when Jim Thorpe dropped, probably my favorite episode because of just how hard it leans into the rake and the Slenderman as these horror-inducing invasive monsters with the capacity to truly upend people's lives. So, would I recommend you go back and re-experience this 8-year-long ARG from start to finish all at once? Well, maybe not, but I'm not saying you shouldn't give it a chance either. It's certainly a time commitment, and you'll be clicking on a lot of wiki links and reading a shit ton of period documents just to know what's going on, but there are some really cool moments that'll stay with you for a long time. My favorite episodes of the show were ones that A, didn't have a lot to do with Habit, and B, spent time riffing off of the dynamic between this big group of friends. Personal favorites include May and June, Outside Help, The Hidden Videos, and, of course, Jim Thorpe. Anytime there was high-stakes horror or action propelled by creepypasta monsters or made use of innovative filming techniques, I was here for it. Outside Help gets a special shout-out for featuring one of the few moments in the series that legit ran a chill down my spine. It's a 9-minute episode concerning a phone call between Evan and Vinny, filmed almost entirely on 2 hidden cameras that have been placed in Evan's basement. The scene switches back and forth between the 2 cameras, ending with Evan acknowledging that he knows they're there. The shot then cuts to a till now unseen 3rd hidden camera in a completely different part of the room before cutting out entirely, and the audio really sells the idea that this isn't a conversation we're supposed to be hearing. It's so well done, and the restraint being shown off by the director is just so good. Oh, even just thinking about it now gives me chills. I feel there's a difference between being subtle and being vague. I already mentioned It Comes at Night and the ways it compounds its vague premise and setting with subtle storytelling techniques to create a really chilling, memorable viewing experience. A more interesting point of comparison, however, has to be with Marble Hornets. By virtue of being primarily found footage, EverymanHYBRID has fewer opportunities for subtlety, a fact that's only worsened by its too vague ARG style of exposition predicated on the existence of internet Nancy Drews with lots of free time on their hands, essentially necessitating dedicated catch-up episodes where the boys tell the audience what the story is for the benefit of us boomers who don't really get into this whole internet thing. Is boomer hate still a thing? I guess my generation's anti-millennial now, but these boys are all millennials, and I think I've been mean enough already. And I don't want to sound like a broken record here. I just really can't overstate how disorienting this series is to keep up with. Unlike House of Leaves, which is at the very least contained to the pages of the book, EverymanHYBRID feels like an exercise in wearing yourself too thin. There are so many disparate pieces to take into account when forming a cohesive picture in your brain that the writing of this video has been a complete nightmare, and I'm sure its disorganized nature will only be exacerbated during the editing process.
Your point of view is
And I haven't even touched on the play from which this series gets its name, but literally none of its content. Included in one of the boxes was a copy of Everyman, a morality play from the Middle Ages about a man, everyman, finding peace and virtue in his life's accomplishments so he can take the escalator up to heaven and kiki with God. The copy found had a few characters and multiple passages of text just completely thrown in there, meant to represent the characters and their story, but all this says to me is that the boys liked the idea of the play and wanted brownie points for seeming well read, but didn't want to do any of the work of incorporating the play's themes or narrative devices into their show. Everyman the Play has fuck all to do with EverymanHYBRID. So to my fellow theater kids, if you go in expecting a modern adaptation, you may leave just as disappointed as a rake stan. If you want a modern adaptation of Everyman, read Brandon Jacobs Jenkins' Everybody instead. I can see the references and the inspiration these guys were trying to pull from, and on paper, it's really cool. I just wish EverymanHYBRID could have been, for me, a bit more than the sum of its parts. And that's the real shame here. It's not that it's a bad show or it's a bad ARG. I just left feeling disappointed and burnt out, which probably at least 60% on me, considering the fact that I took in 8 years of information over the course of a few days. Temper your expectations, I would say, and be prepared to commit to a big ol' experience. If you want a complete, in-depth rundown of the series beat by beat, check out Nightmind's videos from a few years back. They were very helpful in forming some sort of understanding of this whole labyrinthine alternate reality game. And while you're at it, go support the boys. Both Evan and Jeff, the real-life human beings, have Patreons where they post their other artistic endeavors separate from EMH. Evan does a lot of line work illustrations, and from what I've seen, he's really good. Jeff, on the other hand, writes a lot of really cool and weird fiction, and only $2 a month will get you unlimited access to his complete library. His books are also available for sale on Amazon, by the way. I'm currently reading The Revivification Act and loving it so far. I can't, in good conscience, however, encourage anyone to support or engage with Vinny's work until he makes a public statement addressing the allegations made against him. While I made the decision to go ahead with this episode to celebrate and discuss a work that was very important to me as a kid, until this whole situation gets cleared up, I can't even really advocate for you to get into this series. If you're feeling nostalgic or just want your Slender fix, Marble Hornets is right there with a complete 3-season run and a much easier to pick up plot. If you liked this video and watched all the way to the end, please do me a big old favor and hit like and subscribe and tell me whether you agreed with my points or not. It felt weird commenting on the year-long gap in uploads on the EMH main channel because, like, who the hell am I to talk about irregular upload schedules? Jeff still does a lot of vlogs over on his personal channel, and he also streams regularly on Twitch, so go give him a follow over there. And go support Evan's partner Amanda, too. She does a lot of makeup tutorials and vlogs, and she just seems like such a sweetheart. Her and Jeff's channels will be linked in the description below, so go give them some love and tell them I sent you. I'm sure they'll love everything I have to say in this video. Cool. While you're in the mood, follow me on Twitter and Instagram to keep up with my current projects and nostalgia binges. Right now, it's Chugga Conroy and Total Drama Island, so come on over if you want to hear more of my meaningless ramblings about the things that I enjoy. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic night, hybrids. Peace out.